Hey everybody, this video is called the Passover again, and tonight we continue our pass-through study here in the book of 2nd Chronicles, looking at the 35th chapter. We're going to look at the Passover during the reign of King Josiah. So the chronicler in today's chapter, he gives us much more attention to detail than what we find back in 2 Kings 23 verse 21 through 23 on this Passover celebration under the king. In 2 Chronicles chapter 35 verse 1 through 6 to start out, says, "Now Josiah kept the Passover to the Lord in Jerusalem, and they slaughtered the Passover lambs on the 14th day of the first month. And he set the priests in their duties and encouraged them for the service of the house of the Lord. Then he said to the Levites who taught all Israel, who were holy to the Lord, 'Put the holy ark in the house which Solomon, the son of David, the king of Israel, built. It shall no longer be a burden on your shoulders. Now serve the Lord your God and his people Israel. Prepare yourselves according to your fathers' houses, according to your divisions, following the written instruction of David, the king of Israel, and the written instruction of Solomon his son. And stand in the holy place according to the divisions of the fathers' houses of your brethren, the lay people, and according to the division of the fathers' houses of the Levites." Verse 6 as well. "So slaughter the Passover offerings, consecrate yourselves, and prepare them for your brethren, that they may do according to the word of the Lord by the hand of Moses." So tonight in chapter 35, obviously the temple's contents had been disturbed and the sacrifices and the festivals interrupted by the lack of attention, idolatrous practices, and foreign intervention. And as King Hezekiah restored the Passover back in chapter 30 verse 1, we see that King Josiah did as well. In the Passover, it was the central feast and devotion to the Lord. And we find it as early back in Exodus 12 and Exodus chapter 13. And the Ark of the Covenant was to remain in the most holy place, but it had been removed, and probably by Manasseh, who set a carved image in its place. And the law for the carrying of the Ark during the tabernacle days, when it was portable, called for poles to be placed in the rings on the sides. And the Levites, or the Kohathites, they were to carry it with the poles without touching the ark. And we saw that King Uzziah died because he touched the ark while he improperly transported it on the ark and back in 1 Chronicles 13 verse 6 through 10. And now that the temple had been built and the ark had its permanent place, it no longer needed to be transported in the old way. And in verse 6, the prescribed pattern for the Passover in the temple was followed, as we're going to see in our upcoming verses here, verse 7 through 17. And Joash, he understood that it would take an enormous amount of preparation, planning, and to work to properly conduct the Passover. And the priest needed to be set on both and encouraged for this. And in verse 6, it's one of the main features of the Passover was the sacrificial lamb for each household, as seen back in Exodus 12, verse 43 through 49. And this was a great amount of work for the priests to do. In verse 7 through 9 says, "Then Josiah gave the lay people lambs and the young goats from the flock, all the Passover offerings for all who were present, to the number of 30,000, as well as 3,000 cattle. They were from king possessions. And the leaders gave willingly to the people, to the priests, to the Levites, Hilkiah, Zechariah, and Zahiel, rulers of the house of God, gave the priests for the Passover offerings, 2,600 from the flock, and 300 cattle. Also, Conaniah, his brothers Shemaiah and Nathanael, and Hashabiah, and Zael, and Zozabad, chief of the Levites, gave to the Levites for Passover offering, 5,000 from the flock and 500 cattle. So Josiah, he followed a similar pattern to David and Hezekiah. And the contributions were followed by voluntary contributions from others. And in verse 9, we see 500 bulls. They weren't used for the Passover offerings, which required either lamb or goats to be roasted. But the bulls here are sacrificed as peace offerings, much of which are eaten by the worshippers. And King Josiah, he was passionate to have a proper Passover celebration. In verse 10 through 14 says, "So the service was prepared, and the priests stood in their places, and the Levites in their divisions, according to the king's command. And they slaughtered the Passover offerings, and the priests sprinkled the blood with their hands, while the Levites skinned the animals. Then they removed the burnt offerings, that they might give them to the divisions of the fathers' houses of the lay people, to offer the Lord, as it is written in the book of Moses. So they did with the cattle. Also they roasted the Passover offerings with fire, according to the ordinance. But the other holy offerings they boiled in pots, in cauldrons, and in pans, and divided them quickly among the lay people. Then afterward they prepared portions for themselves and for the priests, because the priests, the sons of Aaron, were busy in offering burnt offerings and fat until night. Therefore the Levites prepared proportions for themselves and for the priests, the sons of Aaron." So it seemed that all the sacrifices were directly made by the priests themselves, and they did not allow the head of each household to perform the sacrifice individually. In verse 15 through 19 says, "And the singers, the sons of Asaph, were in their places according to the command of David, Asaph, Heman, and Jeduthun, the king's seer. Also the gatekeepers were at each gate. They did not have to leave their position, because their brethren the Levites prepared portions for them. So all the service of the Lord was prepared to the same day, to keep the Passover and offer burnt offerings on the altar of the Lord, according to the command of King Josiah. And the children of Israel who were present kept the Passover at that time in the feast of the unleavened bread for 7 days. There had been no Passover in Israel like that in the days of Samuel the prophet, and none of the kings of Israel have kept such a Passover as Josiah kept, with the priests and the Levites, all Judah and Israel who were present, and the inhabitants of Jerusalem. In the 18th year of the reign of Josiah, the Passover was kept." So what's interesting about the Passover here is the law of Moses did not direct singing or a communal worship to take place at the celebration of the Passover. But we see King Josiah went above and beyond the law, and he brought in worship. And we see that this commandment to make this especially meaningful and a memorable occasion. And Josiah, he was mindful of security even during the great celebration. And it had been over 400 years since all the kings of Israel and Judah celebrated the Passover. And that is a pretty sad thought here. In verse 20 through 22, "After all this, when Josiah had prepared the temple, Necho, king of Egypt, came up to fight against Carchemish by the Euphrates, and Josiah went against him. But he sent messengers to him, saying, 'What have I to do with you, king of Judah? I have not come against you this day, but against the house of which I have war. For God commanded me to make haste. Refrain from meddling with God, who is with me, lest he destroy you.' Nevertheless, Josiah would not turn his face from him, but disguised himself so that he might fight with him, but did not heed the words of Necho from the mouth of God. So he came to fight in the valley of Megiddo. So the passage of time brings us to what would be taken here in the setting of 609 BC, when the Assyrian Empire was in its death throes. And Nineveh fell in 612 BC to a coalition, including the Babylonians wanting to check the Babylonian advances. And the Egyptians come to help the remaining Assyrian forces. And Josiah, he fell in battle here because he refused to obey divinely directed words of Pharaoh Necho. And we don't know why Josiah wants to impede the progress of Pharaoh Necho. He may have been entangled with the alliance of Necho's enemies. But God conveyed his purposes to the foreign king, as he had with Amalek through a dream in Genesis 20 verse 3. But we see that King Josiah will not listen to it. And Megiddo was the scene of many battles, and Necho likely did not understand that he was speaking for the true God of Israel. So you have this Gentile, this pagan, that is speaking for the Lord. And the sad end of one of the greatest kings of Judah we see takes place here. As 23 through 25 tells us, and the archers shot King Josiah. And the king said to his servants, "Take me away, for I am severely wounded." His servants therefore took him out of that chariot and put him in the second chariot that he had, and they brought him to Jerusalem. So he died and was buried in one of the tombs of his fathers. And all Judah and Jerusalem mourned for Josiah. Jeremiah also lamented for Josiah. And to this day all the men singing and the singing women speak of Josiah in their lamentations. They made it a custom in Israel, and indeed they are written in the laments. So Josiah, we see that he was wounded and killed, though he disguised himself. And Zechariah 12:11 tells us a little bit more of the great mourning, using it to compare the great mourning that will come upon the Jewish people when they turn to their one rejected Messiah. And despite his final weakness, Josiah had been an honorable king of Judah. And in verse 25, we see that Jeremiah uttered a lament. It's often used here to prove that Jeremiah was the author of the book of Lamentations. And Jeremiah indeed may have written the book of Lamentations, but we cannot use verse 25 to put it, beyond a reasonable doubt. And so we see that the people, they continue to mourn the loss of King Josiah up to the writing of the Chronicles in 450 to 430 BC, nearly 200 years after the event. And verse 26-27 ends the chapter. Now the rest of the acts of Josiah and his goodness, according to what was written in the law of the Lord, and his deeds from first to last, indeed, they are written in the book of the kings of Israel and Judah. So verse 26 and 27, when you compare the details of Josiah's tragic death with 2 Kings 23, verse 28 through 30, the events become much clearer on how everything happened. Unfortunately, though, Josiah will be the last good king of Judah that we're going to see. And the people of the kingdom turn against God very quickly after the reign of Josiah. And how often in history has that happened? After a mighty warrior of God, they go and things just totally go their opposite way. And to wrap up today's study here, the chronicler, he shows us the great Passover as he directs the priests and the Levites to carry out the Passover. And verse 7 through 9 covers the lambs provided for the Passover sacrifice. Verses 10 through 14 covered the slaughter of the Passover lambs and the sacrificial meal. And the chronicler, he's showing the greatness of King Josiah's Passover in verses 15 through 19. We see that King Josiah goes on to reject or disregards God's warning and he decides to do his own act of going to war in verse 20 through 22. And we see Necho's divine prophecy as a Gentile, where God spoke through this Gentile. And there's a passage in the New Testament where God spoke through a non-disciple, like a Gentile as well. And I want to look at John chapter 11, verse 49 through 52. It says, and one of them, Caiaphas, being high priest that year, said to them, you know nothing at all, nor do you consider that is expedient for us, that one man should die for the people, but not for that the whole nation should perish. Now this he did not say in his own authority, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation, and not only for that nation, but also that he would gather together in one the children of God who were scattered abroad. So when I think of today's passage with the Pharaoh speaking within God's divine will, I think of the Sadducee Caiaphas speaking and prophesying the death of Jesus to come. And the chronicler, he shows that Josiah was shot by the archer, killing him, and we see his burial in verses 23 through 25. In the chapter, it ends with the summary of the good reign of this king Josiah. And that's going to wrap up this video for today. We'll see you tomorrow as we're going to wrap up 2 Chronicles. So I hope you have a great weekend up ahead, and I hope that you catch the wrap-up video. God bless.